Hello and welcome to the programme which looks at the Holy Land. I am Paul Calvert. Psalm 102 verse 1 from the New King James Bible says this: Hear my prayer, O Lord, and let my cry come to you. I'm with Miri Nehari. Now Miri, your father was one of the key leaders of Ha Bricha. What is Ha Bricha and how did your father get involved?
Oh wow, that's a big question. Ha Bricha, in English, escape, meaning escape, is the movement of the Jews post-World War II. I'm taking you on a time machine back to 1944, mid-summer of 1944. Even before the war ended, areas that were freed from Nazi army, for example, in the Balkans, in East Poland, or in Italy, where the Americans had conquered Rome in the summer of 1944, Jews have started to organize themselves for two purposes. One, to help each other, and two, to think of ways, to find ways to go to Israel, which was at the time Palestine, Israel. And so it's amazing how people out of a war are organizing, getting themselves to finding the energy to organize and help each other and create a base for life, actually. So Ha Bricha is a movement that was started by the Holocaust survivors, which I think it's a nice way to say they had to choose, and they chose life. They could choose to be victims and they could choose to die. And many of them after the war said, what should I live for? There's nothing. They believed there's no Jewish people anymore. But they chose life. And they started organizing to go to Israel, to their homeland. They refused to stay, most of them, not all of them, refused to stay in Europe, which has become the great Jewish graveyard. Just to give you an example, in Poland, for example, there were 1 million children before the war, up to the about of 18. And after the war, there was about 5,000 children left alive. It's really horrendous. So the Bricha started, the survivors chose the word Bricha, escape, and they said, we are escaping from Europe, which we do not want to live in, and we are escaping to Israel, which we hope will be our country. We know that it isn't yet, but we hope one day it will be our homeland, our country. Few months after the war, September and October, emissaries from Israel, actually earlier, people from Israel had come to Europe to help this organization. It was only a movement at the time, and make this movement actually an organization. First came the Jewish Brigade soldiers, Israelis who volunteered to enlist in the British Army to fight Hitler. And when the war ended, they had become, as somebody said, they changed from being soldiers of the King of Britain. They became soldiers of the Bricha and helped the survivors in any way they could. And then came emissaries from Israel. And so the Bricha is actually the journey of the Holocaust survivors, most of them, throughout Europe, first out of the countries under the Soviet regime, mostly to Austria and Germany, and then to the countries bordering the Mediterranean Sea, to where the Ma'apilim ships, the illegal ships, would try to take them to Israel, and usually they ended up in Cyprus, in camps, in British camps. So the Aliyah, the way to Israel after the war, has two chapters. One chapter is the journey by land in Europe, and the second chapter is the journey by sea from the shores of Europe to Israel, where the British usually stopped them from entering the country for different reasons. So there were about 3,000 people, men, women, and children, moving in Europe, some of them more organized, some of them less organized, some of them part of the way organized and part of the way not organized. And they were transparent people. They had no papers. They belonged to no country. They refused to be Poles or Germans or Czechs or Russians. And they were still not Israelis because there was no Israel at the time. And it's like the exodus from Egypt. When the Jews left Egypt, it says in the Bible, they traveled and they stopped, and they traveled and they stopped. So they did in Europe, in the exodus from Europe. They traveled, all of it illegally. Then they would stop at camps, either Bricha camps or DP camps, displaced persons camps. When they were in the DP camps, which were organized by the armies, American, and mostly American, British, and some French armies, and under the ones that worked in the camps was UNRWA, its UN branch. They were legal. When they came into the camp, they were registered. They would register, and they were legal, and they would get food. Sometimes very little, like there were camps that would give Jews only 1,200 calories a day, which is not enough. Some would give them 2,000 calories, which is still not really, and that's after 5 years of Holocaust. And then they would leave the camp, one camp, going on their way to Israel, to another camp, and to another camp. On the way from one camp to another would be again illegal. For example, one of the problems of crossing borders was getting out of Berlin. Coming into Berlin was difficult because you had to cross, Poles had to cross the border, the Polish border, and then would go and come into the British Army zone. So they would have to cross the British Army zone border. And then Berlin was like an island. Getting out of Berlin was very difficult because they were transparent. They had no... Okay, so all this journey was crossing borders illegally, having forged identities. You would sometimes have... when getting out of Poland to Czechoslovakia, it would be maybe an Austrian who's going home, and from Czechoslovakia to Austria, you would be an Austrian from a certain area going home, and then from that area would be an Austrian from another area, because you had to cross the border from the Russian zone to the British zone or to the American zone. And then you may be an Austrian trying to go to Peru. And for each one of those identities, you would have papers, because they were very good at making forged papers. And the way the traveling was many times by foot. They actually had to cross the Tatra Mountains from Poland to Czechoslovakia, always at night, very cold, very difficult. A real great project, I think, with children and with people who were just after the Holocaust, not always very strong. Sometimes you could cross, sometimes they'd use lorries, and then you could cross at a border station, formal border station, with forged identities. Sometimes they would have a list of a group. It was a group list of all the people who were crossing, and they would have to prepare the list ahead of time. So a man would be the husband of a woman he never met, and they would have a child whom either of them had ever met, and because the list had a family of a father, a mother, and a child. So they would take a man, a woman, and a child and told them, now, for this crossing, you're a family. Learn well your identities, because if you forget or if you get mixed up, the whole group will suffer, maybe returned back to where they came from, or sent, depending where it is, to prison and so forth. So the Bricha actually got this journey there was people to move, and there were camps to have, and there were forged documents to make, and you would have to find the way to where and how to cross the borders. that would be from the summer of 1944 to, we say, to the 1950, early or end of 1949, because that's when the displaced persons camps closed. Now, at that time, it's different from now, UNRWA at that time said a displaced person is just for 5 years. You have 5 years where we will help you. We will give you food, even if little, but some food and some medical care. And then after 5 years, you're on your own. Here in Israel, from 48, people are still under UNRWA getting, that's many years. At the time, it was only 5. So the war ended in 1945. By 50, all the camps closed, and there were no more refugees. Everybody had to find a way to live for themselves. So for 5 years, the Bricha actually was in Europe. For 5 years, all across Europe, except from England, of course, and Albania or so. There were Jews in Sweden also. They were taken, there was one Ma'apilim. Ma'apilim is people who came to Israel illegally on ships, coming from Sweden. So that's one more thing about the Bricha, before I leave it, is the problem or the issue of children. That was very dramatic and very acute. There were children with no parents in the streets, in monasteries, and coming from the woods, coming from hiding places. So the Bricha, Jews always have their movements, and they fight each other like parties. But on the children issue, they're all together, working together, coordinating the work to save, first you had to find them, then to save them. And then they had built, they called it children's homes, not orphanages, because they said, well, maybe we'll find the parents or somebody from the family. And there was a great thing to take care of children who have lived through the Holocaust. Wow. With all the people say now, how do you deal with something so horrible as the October 7th? And then they had to deal with the Shoah, with the Holocaust. How do you deal psychologically with the Holocaust survivors? No one knew. So the Bricha worked with those children, and they were taken illegally, sometimes walking, holding each other hands during the night, the babies with their mouths taped, not to cry. So that's something about the Bricha. Now my father, it's a very long story. He was born in Kovel, which was Poland at the time. Now it's Ukraine. And he was preparing to, in a Zionist youth movement, to come to Israel. And he was in a group, they call it Hachshara. His name is Tzvi Netzer. At the time it was Melnitzer. And they were preparing in Warsaw, in a camp in Warsaw, to come to Israel. And when the war started, the Germans entered Poland. They decided the whole Hachshara camp to run away to the east, hoping that the Red Army would stop the Germans. And there was a big story. He was asked to bring money to the Soviet Union. He was caught. He was sentenced to gulags in Siberia. A great, what a story. He survived Siberia. And in 1941, when Russia joined the Allies, all the political prisoners were allowed out of the prison. So he was political. So many Jews fled from Poland to Russia and found them Soviet Union and found themselves in Siberia. So they moved down to the to the warmer countries. And he did all this huge, long way in Russia to what they call the Asian Russia, the Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, the Stan countries. And he fled from Azerbaijan as a stowaway on a ship to Tehran on the Caspian Sea in a barrel. And there he joined the Israeli emissaries to Tehran who were taking care of Jewish children from Poland who were sent to Tehran with the Russian army. There was a Russian army that was going to fight with the Allies against the Germans. And they took children, Jewish children. So the Jewish children were taken out of the Catholic camps, were lured out. And he worked with them and came to Israel as a really Hollywood story, dressed as a British officer. He didn't know a word English. And he joined my mother, whom he knew in Poland, and they married. And 2 years later, in Tehran, he met Shaul Avigur, who was the head of the Mossad, L'Aliyah Bet, the Mossad. And Shaul Avigur met him in Tehran, and 2 years after he came to Israel in 1943. In 1945, Shaul called him, not only him, people whom he chose very particularly, to please go back to Russia and head the Bricha there. And emissaries from Israel, like my father, he was from Poland, he was sent to Poland. A Jew that came from Czechoslovakia was sent to Czechoslovakia. One from Austria that knew the country, knew the customs, knew the language, was sent to head the Bricha in that country. So my father became the head of the Bricha in Poland. And in Poland, it was all the Jews that ran away from Poland to the Soviet Union could come back only through Poland. So there was an agreement between Stalin and the Polish government that Poles who fled from Poland to Russia could go back to Poland. So Jews, about 80,000 Jews, Polish Jews, returned from Russia, all of them to Poland. So through the Bricha's hand, my father's hands, went about close to 200,000 people. They moved, one route was through in the north to Germany, in Szczecin, a Polish town, to Germany. And it was a British zone, under British zone. And the other route was south to Czechoslovakia. And from Czechoslovakia to Austria to a Russian zone. That was the route. And from the Russian zone to the American zone. Germany and Austria were the Central European countries where the DP camps, the displaced persons camps, were set.
Now, are you following in your father's footsteps by being the head of the Ha Bricha Association today?
When both my parents died, not together, we thought of doing something to honor them. And we looked into a couple of things, and we decided the Bricha is not known. It's a chapter, a heroic, great, unbelievable chapter in the history of Judaism and Israel, which somehow had managed to be not known, to be lost in the track of history. Many Jews, partly because it was so hush-hush, unknown. People didn't know. The Bricha people themselves didn't know, like one of the Bricha persons told me in Israel. Somebody told us to mount the train, go on the train. So we went on the train. And I assume now that he had tickets and he had papers and he knew what he was doing. And then somebody told us to get off the train. So we went off the train with a lot of trust in people they didn't know before. So we went off the train and somebody was waiting for us and gave us tea and sandwiches and took us to a place and took care of us, and then they moved us to somebody else. They didn't understand what was going on. It was so,
like uncharted territory.
Yeah, it was. So the people themselves didn't know how they moved from one place to the other. Sometimes they say that the Red Cross helped them because the Red Cross was legal and known. Sometimes they say that the Joint Jewish Philanthropic Agency helped them because it was legal and known. And they did help them. The ones that carried the Bricha were just unknown. You didn't know who they were and how they would do it, how they were doing it, and why they were doing it. For example, one time in Austria, they decided the British had closed from Austria you wanted to go to Italy, and from Italy you'd go on the ships. Once you reached Italy, Italians were very hospitable, and it was mostly legitimate, and there were Jewish camps, the Bricha had camps, and they were not illegal anymore, and so they wanted to go to Italy. So the British, in 1947 mostly, the British had closed all the ways from Austria to Italy. The main route was called the Kvish, Baruch Hashem, I'll remember in a minute, where lorries could go, or transportation. It's still there now. It's a big, huge highway. At the time, it was a small road. The Brenner Pass. The Brenner Pass was the pass between Austria and Italy, and it was in the British Army zone. So they closed it completely before it was closed. But how somehow Jews, the stories of how Jews, if we have time, I can tell you a story. But the one I want to tell you now is, so they had made a DP camp in an Austrian city near the Alps, hoping to cross the Alps by foot or to cross through the French zone. And Salzburg was a big, very big Bricha center. There were about 7 or 8 camps, refugee camps in Salzburg. So the way from Salzburg to this Saalfelden city where they had a new camp was through, the best way was go through Germany, through a little part of Germany. So they would take the people on a lorry, go to Germany. Some of the people would stay in Germany because German camps, DP camps in Germany were much better. The life situation was much better. And people from Germany who wanted to go quicker to Israel would go on the lorry. And the lorry would start with like 30 people from Salzburg and arrive 30 people at Saalfelden near the Alps. But maybe different people with the same ID, with the same papers. Some stayed in Germany, some from Germany went on the... So, they were doing like really inventive, extraordinary. And people didn't know, the Holocaust survivors themselves didn't know that you wanted to go to Germany. Okay, this is your station, get out. Get off the car and you get papers. You want to go to Austria and move quicker to go on. But the whole organization of this trip, they were not aware, people, the Holocaust survivors, of the whole plan of things. So my father was supposed to go for half a year, and they kept him for 2.5 years. And he came back when the Bricha almost ended, to the voices of the guns of the Atzmaut, of the Independence Day war in Israel. And he, most of the time, he had many different identities, mostly a Holocaust survivor. He spoke Polish, he spoke Yiddish, he spoke Russian. He knew the Russian people because who came from Siberia. So that's my father.
Now, your family have been through all of this in Europe, and today we've seen on October the 7th this terrible, terrible massacre that took place here in Israel. And now from that we're seeing a lot of anti-Semitism in Europe. Have we learned any lessons, and do you think Jews that are living in Europe today should actually leave and come here to Israel?
That's a big question. Can I add a chapter that I forgot, very little? When my father came from the Bricha, he went back to the kibbutz. He was in the kibbutz. He went back to his kibbutz, and in 1946, very suddenly, Poland opened its border for Jews. Jews could leave Poland. So he was called again to Poland. 1956. Gomulka's government, he was the head of the government, opened its borders. So in Israel there was a bureau that's called Nativ, which also means a way. Nativ is a way, a route. A Nativ bureau was also a hush-hush bureau, dealing with the Jews behind the Iron Curtains, all the Soviet and the other countries. So Poland was the first one that actually opened its border, and my father was sent there, this time to the embassy as a diplomat with formal diplomatic passport, but actually he was working for Nativ, and his main job was to help Jews, also Jews who came from Russia now, to come to Israel. So his mission in life was to help Jews, to save Jews where it's difficult, in countries where they were suffering, and if they wanted to come to Israel, to help them come to Israel. Now to your question. I think there's a really huge difference between the Bricha time and the times now, also Nativ time. The difference is that we have a country, in the family of the countries of the world. We are a nation, and and accepted as a nation in the family of nations. During the Bricha, we weren't. There was no Jewish nation. Just to give an example, and that's a story about the British. There was this British DP camp, displaced persons camp, and a few soldiers, British soldiers with British uniform, but Jewish. They were the Jewish brigade soldiers. One of them was an officer, came to this DP camp and went to the commander of the camp. He received them properly because they were British soldiers, and asked if he has Jewish survivors in the camp. And he said, no, I have no Jews. So can we walk in the camp? Can we visit the camp? Yes, go ahead, visit the camp. So they visited the camp, and they went back to his office and said, why did you say you have no Jews? You have more than 100. You have close to 200 Jews. So he told them, listen, my mission is to send displaced persons back to their countries. And you see on my wall, there's a chart. I send Poles to Poland, Germans to Germany, Russians to Russia, Ukrainians to Ukraine. Do I have a Judea country? For me, there are no Jews. Either they're Poles or they're Germans or no Jews. And I send them to their countries. And actually, quite a few times, Jews were forcibly and violently put on lorries and sent back, usually to Poland.
Which is where the Holocaust was.
So, and if the British caught, for example, I have a story also of the Jewish brigade person. He was a sergeant, and he was given, and he said, he was asked by his Bricha handler, and he said, when my Bricha handler asks me, that's a command, to have 60 lorries. At noon exactly, at the train station in Treviso, which is a country in the north of Italy, on the border of Austria. I didn't know why he asked me, so that was an order, and I had 60 lorries. I couldn't have enough of our own, for the British ones, so I asked some American ones. I even had a black driver on this group. And it turned out that there was a train of 800 Jews that the Bricha had managed to put in the train from Germany to Italy. The British at the beginning thought they were Italians going back to Italy. When they realized they were Jews, they gave the master of the train station an order to turn, as the train arrives, to put a new train engine and send them back to Germany. The whole train, as with all 800 Jews, back to Germany. So this Jewish British corporal from the brigade says, we came one by one, the trains went in the station very quickly. Each one got 30 people or so, another one. By the time train station master came to send the train back to Germany, there were no Jews in the train station. Of course, now the Jewish brigade people had 800 people to take care of, which they were not prepared for. Food and lodgings and so forth. And they did, taken their own food and their own blankets and tents and so forth. But the point was that the British were going to send back Jews who had managed to arrive to Italy to Germany, because
the British were actually a hindrance to the Jewish people, and I imagine many, many Jews died because of the way that the British were acting at the time.
Well, that's going too far. The British were a great hindrance. They understood. They weren't stupid. They knew every Jew traveling in routes of Europe was potentially a ma'apil who was going to Israel, at least potentially. So they tried to stop. And I have letters from the foreign ministry and from the government, for example, to the Foreign Office, the Polish Foreign Office, reprimanding them. Why do you let Jews go out of your country? Which they didn't, but the Jews did go out. And there were MI5 and the MI6 and the Secret Service of the Army and the Secret Service of the colonies and the Secret Service of the Israel and the area here. It was all of them were working to find out about Jews traveling in Europe. They were joining efforts, all of them, to intelligence was the word I was talking about. Many intelligence bureaus, British, were working and there was an intelligent person in every border station, British intelligence, to catch the Jews. They didn't cause their death. And I think interesting and lucky for us and unlucky for Britain is that They had a lot of information. They actually knew a lot. I have an article written by a British Secret Service person to a very important journal, professional journal, saying, what did the British know about the Bricha? And at the end he says that they knew pretty much everything, most of the things. And they had operations, intelligence operation on the Jews, and they would people in the Bricha groups to find out how they work. And they really worked hard. But the policy was wrong. I mean, they didn't have much choice. The British policy was that the Jewish refugee problem in Europe is a European problem. Europeans made it, and Europeans should take care of it. And it has nothing to do with Palestine. It had everything to do with Palestine. So with the ships, they only 8 illegal survivors ships made their way to, the first 8, made their way through the British blockade. Other 58 ships, all were caught by the British Navy because they had the intelligence and they could stop the ships and take the survivors to camps in Cyprus to hold them. Again, behind barbed wire, again with watchtowers and soldiers. So the intelligence for the Hapala was there, the ships, and the ability of the army to work on the intelligence was there. With the Bricha, there was intelligence, and there was a lot of effort put into the gathering the information. But they couldn't do much because they'd ordered the government of Germany not to let Jews in or not to let Jews out. Everybody was happy to get the Jews out, and sometimes the Bricha paid the government. So they were happy. Get the Jews out. We get the Jews out, we make the British angry, which is nice. We make the British embarrassed, which is nice, and we're very happy. So the British had no good plan what to do with the information they had. I must say, the British were careful, also with the ships. They were not really violent. They weren't letting Jews come to Israel, but they weren't killing them. They didn't want them. They would have liked them to disappear, which they didn't. Like the Arab population want us from Israel now to do. If we could evaporate, that would be very happy. But we're not evaporating. But they didn't kill them. They made it much harder. And they made us use a lot of more ingenuity and find ways to organize the journey, to carry out the plans for the journey, the idea of a journey. But they didn't kill. Not really. They weren't.
With the rise in anti-Semitism, do you think we've learned anything?
You asked me what lesson we can learn. So I think there's no lesson to learn about the trip, the journey. Because now there is a state of Israel, and it's legal, and if you want to come to Israel, you can come to Israel. Just apply to the embassy or whatever, and it can be done. Unless you're in the Soviet Union, which is different. The lesson that we Jews can learn is how to receive new immigrants in the country. When the Holocaust survivors came to Israel, they were not well received. It was a poor country. It was a country fighting for its life. It was a country run by very young people. And some of them had to go to the independence war about a week after they had arrived. They would arrive to Israel, would get a week to get organized in a new country with no language, with no nothing, with no help, and then be taken to fight in the army. Some of them died before even visiting anything in the army. So I'm telling us Israelis, if new people come to Israel, receive them well.
What can Christians around the world do to combat anti-Semitism and support the Jewish people at this time? Is it important for Christians to be encouraging Aliyah, for instance?
Look, I don't know about Aliyah. I think this is something that people have to decide from. I can't conceive why a person doesn't want to go to live in Israel but some don't. And life here is difficult. Life in Israel is difficult. Really difficult in many ways and from many points of view. But okay, so I wouldn't tell anybody, you have a country and you better come and help build it and keep it prospering. I think Christians and anybody, any good people, many Christians are good people, should fight anti-Semitism. I think anti-Semitism is something very wrong and very unjust. hating a people and doing wrong to people just because they belong to a certain race or tribe is like hating British because they're British, not because they've done you any wrong. So anti-Semitism is not about religion, and it's not about land, and it's not about money. It's about you being a Jew, or us being Jews, even if we're poor and we have no country. So, yes, I think good people should fight anti-Semitism. I think nowadays it's difficult because Israel is a thorn in the eye of the Muslims. They don't want Israel in a Muslim area. I think partly because life in Israel is so good, and they don't want Arabs to see how women live in Israel, what is the standards of life, what is the kind of education we have. I don't know, that's my guess. Yeah. So they don't want us here because we remind them of how democracy can be.
With everything that your family has been through, and seeing how the mood has changed so quickly since October the 7th, have you been shocked at how the anti-Semitism has risen so quickly and the mood has changed so quickly?
Yes, I have. I think I don't know. This is an area, on the Bricha, I'm an expert. On this, I'm not. So my guess is that part of the anti-Semitism has to do with the large number of Muslims in European countries and in the States. Muslims are a high percentage of the population in France, in Sweden, in England also, and they are against us. I still don't know why, but I know, but I believe we could have lived differently. But I think part of the anger at Israel is because something terrible happens in Gaza. And irrespective of the fact whether we Israelis are right or wrong, or we had another option or not, something very sad is happening there. And maybe we didn't have any option, but it's sad. And people are suffering. And so that helps. I think anti-Semitism is a case that something sad happens with the Druze who are being slaughtered and raped and killed. Something terrible happened in Iran when they were protesting in the streets and they were just killed or jailed and tortured. And the world has said nothing. No one knows about it. And when it happens in Israel, everybody is against it. I am also against it. But we are not the only one where sad things and bad things are happening. And maybe we are the ones where we have no other options, or so we think. So yes, I'm surprised at the quickness, how quickly anti-Semitism has risen its ugly head.
What is your prayer, your hope for Israel at this time?
My prayer, I'm what they call lefty. My prayer is that the war would end and that we would come to live in peace in this area with the Arabs, and that we are different, but where we can accept the differences, they can accept our difference, and we should accept theirs. And I think that the Palestinian question in the territories, as this is called, should find an answer. I'm against this constant fighting. And I think there are two people, this sad situation, historical situation, where there are two people who claim the same, such small piece of land. Such tiny piece of land. Israel is so tiny that its name is written on the sea, not on the land, in the maps. So there is enough room in the land to write its name. We should find, and I think the Arabic world is a big world, and Islamic world is a big world, with lots of land and lots of people. I don't know what the outcome can be, but it should be one of acceptance. If not love, at least acceptance and peace. And I think at the moment both countries are not. The Palestinians want us gone, and maybe we want them gone, and I believe no one is going.
Tell us about your association.
Okay, we decided to put up an association with no money. Nobody is earning anything. That its aim is to make this Ha Bricha story, or historical chapter, part of the history of the Jewish people and the history of Israel. Known and acknowledged, and it's neither acknowledged nor known. For example, in Israel, there is no museum or street or town or even school or bridge that commemorates the Bricha story. There are 2 museums of Ha. This is the part of the Way on Sea. There are endless museums and commemoration places for the Shoah and for Independence Day and for the Ha, and none for the Bricha. Like even the Israeli government doesn't yet recognize this part of history. And we want to make it part of history, and we want to make it known, acknowledged, and part of the story. So we have lectures and conferences, and we've put up 3 books. And we have, together with the Keren Kayemet L'Israel, who helped us, they have put up route in the Carmel Mountain in commemoration of the Bricha. It's called the Bricha route, and it has stones telling the story. And we are trying to put up a museum or be part of a museum. And as we are not recognized, as the Bricha is not recognized by the government, we are not recognized, and we need money. All the people who work in this association are volunteers. No one is not only getting money, but not even getting expenses. If they travel for the Bricha Association, they do not get back expenses. And we would like very much people to donate for us, because we're at the moment working on putting up a museum, a Bricha museum.
What has been your experience of meeting British and German Christians who acknowledge the wrongdoing of their forefathers and want to make amends?
It's been a really moving experience. I've met a few. I've met Rosie and some of her friends. And it was this meeting and those people. I also met some German people later. Their actions and their words were so moving to me. Like, there's this person, the survivor, who met my father and said, "Now I know that someone wants me to live. I realize, because you're an emissary from Israel, and somebody wants me alive." And I feel that somebody recognizes what has happened to us, and it's a really moving experience for me. Important, even though it doesn't have to be in large scale. It's very moving. Sometimes I'm embarrassed, like people ask me forgiveness. No, there's no need, but it's really nice and it's really moving and important.
So in the rise of all this anti-Semitism, does that give you some hope?
That's going too far. There's some good people, some really good people, and some, I don't understand this anti-Semitism. I mean, I can lecture about it, but deep down inside me, I don't understand why people hate me. What have I done wrong except being Jewish? Which I couldn't control. I mean, it's not. So I don't really understand anti-Semitism. The anti-Semitism now I understand. Much of it is anti-Israel. And it has to do with the Muslims wanting us out of this country. If we could be, all of us, 9 million Jews taken, maybe, I don't know, to somewhere, to the moon, there would be less anti-Semitism. Israelis. But anti-Semitism proper, I think it's going too far. I think Christians, English or German, who are really clearly wanting to be with us and understand where we come from, I don't see how they can really fight, unless, in their small towns, in their small areas, in their neighborhoods, in their schools. But I'm a little pessimistic about anti-Semitism.
Well, Miri, thank you very much for sharing today.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to tell the story.
Thank you for joining us today. Pray that God will move by his mighty power in the Holy Land and bring his peace.